The settler's hands trembled as he held the strange golden kernels. Around him, fellow colonists were dying, not from attacks, not from disease alone, from starvation. The year was 1609, and in Jamestown, Virginia, the English settlement was entering what would later be called the starving time. Of the 214 colonists present when winter began, only 60 would survive to see spring. They resorted to eating leather from their boots, rats from the fort, and eventually, as archaeological evidence would later reveal, even the dead. Yet, just miles away, Native American villages thrived with abundant food stores, their storage pits filled with enough grain to last through multiple winters. The difference between life and death, between extinction and survival, came down to a single crop that European settlers had spent months dismissing as inferior, strange, and beneath their dignity to cultivate. That crop was corn, and the story of how European settlers finally learned to accept it reveals one of the most dramatic cultural collisions in American history. The English colonists who established Jamestown in 1607 weren't prepared for North America. This statement seems obvious now, but the depth of their unpreparedness went far beyond what most people realize. These men, and they were mostly men in the early years, came from a society where agriculture had been refined over thousands of years. England's farming practices descended directly from techniques developed in the Fertile Crescent, passed through Roman occupation, and perfected through medieval experience. They knew how to grow wheat. They understood barley and rye. They knew when to plant based on English weather patterns, how to prepare European soil, and how to harvest grains that had fed their ancestors since time immemorial. This knowledge was useless in Virginia. The land the Jamestown settlers chose for their fort was, by any reasonable agricultural standard, terrible. It was a marshy peninsula in the James River, selected for defensive purposes rather than farming potential. The water was brackish, a mix of fresh and salt water that changed with the tides. During summer, this water became a breeding ground for disease. The soil was poor. The location was surrounded by the territories of the Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful alliance of Native American tribes numbering around 15,000 people who had sophisticated agricultural systems that the English initially failed to recognize or respect. The settlers' first priority was finding gold, not establishing farms. They had been sent by the Virginia Company, a joint stock corporation that expected quick returns on investment. Gold would provide those returns. Farming was something they could do later, they thought, once they'd secured the wealth that surely must be hiding somewhere in this new land. When reality set in and no gold appeared, the settlers finally turned to agriculture. They planted wheat seeds brought from England. The crop failed. They tried barley. It failed. European grain simply didn't thrive in Virginia's climate, which was far hotter and more humid than anything in England. The growing season was different. The rainfall patterns didn't match English expectations. The soil composition was wrong for European crops that had been bred for millennia to grow in European conditions. The settlers faced a fundamental problem. Everything they knew about farming was useless, and they were running out of time. The Powhatan people, meanwhile, had been cultivating corn in the region for at least 1,000 years. They had adapted varieties specifically for Virginia's climate and soil conditions. Their fields produced abundant harvests using techniques that had been refined through countless generations of experimentation and observation. They planted corn in mounds, often mixing it with beans and squash in a method now called the Three Sisters. The corn stalks provided support for bean vines to climb. The beans, through bacteria in their roots, fixed nitrogen back into the soil, enriching it for future crops. The broad squash leaves spread across the ground, shading the soil to retain moisture and suppress weeds. This wasn't primitive farming. It was sophisticated agricultural engineering that had been perfected over centuries. But the English settlers looked at Native American farming methods and saw them as inferior. This perception came from deep-rooted cultural beliefs about what farming should look like. English agriculture involved plowing fields in straight rows, often with ox teams pulling metal plows. It involved careful organization, measured planting, and techniques that looked orderly and controlled to European eyes. Native American farming looked chaotic by comparison. The mound seemed random. The mixing of multiple crops in the same space violated European agricultural principles that called for organized, separated planting. The lack of metal tools seemed primitive. The whole system appeared to English observers as unsophisticated, despite the fact that it produced more food per acre than English methods could achieve in American conditions. This cultural prejudice had deadly consequences. John Smith, one of Jamestown's early leaders, recorded interactions with the Powhatan where Native Americans offered corn and attempted to teach English settlers how to cultivate it. Some colonists accepted this help. Others resented the implication that they needed to learn farming from people they considered primitive. This attitude was documented in letters sent back to England, where settlers expressed frustration at having to eat Indian bread made from corn rather than wheat bread like civilized English people. They viewed corn as animal feed, not suitable for human consumption, despite the fact that it was keeping them alive. This perception had roots in European agricultural hierarchy, where wheat was the prestige grain associated with wealth and refinement, while other grains were considered inferior. The prejudice against corn wasn't just about unfamiliarity. It was bound up in European ideas about civilization itself. Wheat bread had been the staple of Mediterranean civilizations since ancient times. It appeared in the Bible. It was central to Christian communion rituals. European culture had elevated wheat to a status beyond mere food. It represented civilization, order, and proper Christian living. Corn, by contrast, was associated with Native Americans who the English viewed as uncivilized. To adopt corn as a staple crop felt, to many settlers, like abandoning their English identity and descending into what they feared was a primitive state. They would rather starve than make that psychological adjustment. The winter of 1609 to 1610 proved how deadly this attitude could be. The starving time at Jamestown killed approximately 70% of the colony's population. The survivors ate everything available: horses, dogs, cats, rats, leather, and eventually each other. Archaeological excavations in the 1990s and 2000s uncovered clear evidence of cannibalism during this period, including the remains of a 14-year-old girl whose bones showed signs of being carefully butchered after death. The colonists were literally dying of starvation while refusing to fully adopt the agricultural methods that would have saved them. Some settlers did plant corn and learned Native American cultivation techniques, which is why anyone survived at all. But the colony's leadership remained focused on other priorities, and many individual settlers clung to their prejudices about proper English grain even as they wasted away. The situation only began to improve when colonists finally, reluctantly, accepted that survival in Virginia required abandoning European agricultural methods and learning from Native Americans. This acceptance came slowly and incompletely. By 1612, John Rolfe, who would later marry Pocahontas, had successfully cultivated tobacco as a cash crop, which gave the Virginia colony an economic foundation. But tobacco didn't feed people. Corn did. The settlers who survived were the ones who swallowed their cultural pride and learned to plant corn in mounds, to mix it with beans and squash, and to prepare it using Native American techniques. They learned to make cornbread, hominy, and other corn-based foods that would eventually become central to American cuisine. But this learning process took years, and many people died because of the delay caused by cultural stubbornness. Plymouth colony, established in 1620, faced similar challenges. The pilgrims who arrived on the Mayflower were even less prepared than the Jamestown settlers had been. They arrived in November, far too late to plant any crops that year. They had landed well north of their intended destination, in territory that was colder than Virginia and had a shorter growing season. More than half the original 102 passengers died during their first winter. They survived primarily by finding stored corn that Native Americans had buried, and by the extraordinary intervention of Tisquantum, known to history as Squanto, who taught them how to plant corn using Native American methods. Squanto's story reveals the complicated nature of cultural knowledge transfer in colonial America. He was a Patuxet man who had been kidnapped by English explorers in 1614 and sold into slavery in Spain. He eventually gained his freedom, learned English, and returned to North America in 1619, only to discover that his entire village had been wiped out by disease, likely introduced by earlier European visitors. When the Pilgrims arrived and established Plymouth on the site of his destroyed village, Squanto became an interpreter and teacher. He showed the Pilgrims how to plant corn, where to fish, and how to extract sap from maple trees. Without his help, Plymouth Colony would likely have followed the fate of earlier failed settlements like Popham Colony in Maine, which lasted only 1 year before being abandoned. The technique Squanto taught the Pilgrims has become famous in American folklore, though recent historical research has questioned whether it was actually a traditional Native American practice or something Squanto had learned from European fishing communities during his time abroad. He showed them how to place small fish, specifically herring, which ran in massive numbers up New England streams each spring into planting mounds to fertilize the corn. Whether this was truly an ancient Native American technique or a European method adapted for New World conditions, it worked. The Pilgrims planted 20 acres of corn in the spring of 1621, and by autumn they had harvested enough to feel confident in their survival. This success led to the harvest celebration that would later be mythologized as the First Thanksgiving. But acceptance of corn remained incomplete. Edward Winslow, one of the Plymouth leaders, wrote in his account of the colony's first year that while their corn grew well according to the manner of the Indians, their peas planted using English methods were not worth the gathering because they had been parched by the sun. The evidence was clear. Native American crops and cultivation methods worked in America, while English crops and methods largely failed. Yet Winslow's account still reflects a reluctance to fully embrace this reality. He was documenting failure of English agriculture and success of Native American agriculture, but framing it in ways that suggested this was temporary, that eventually English methods would prevail once they figured out the right adjustments. This resistance to fully adopting corn persisted for generations after the initial colonies became established. Throughout the 1600s and into the 1700s, American colonists preferred wheat bread when they could get it. Wheat remained the prestige grain, served at important meals and special occasions. Corn was what you ate when you couldn't afford wheat or when wheat wasn't available. This social hierarchy of grains was reflected in everything from colonial cookbooks to economic records showing what people purchased when they had money versus what they grew for subsistence. The wealthy ate wheat bread. The poor ate cornbread. This distinction mattered enormously to people's sense of social status and identity. The prejudice was strongest in northern colonies, where wheat could sometimes be successfully grown. In Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York, settlers planted wheat whenever possible. They established grist mills to grind wheat into flour, seeing this as a marker of civilization and proper English culture being maintained in the wilderness. The mills were often among the most important buildings in a settlement, symbols of European technology and culture persisting in America. Corn mills existed too, but they were considered less prestigious. A town with a proper wheat mill had achieved something important. It had brought English agriculture to America. A town that only had corn mills had merely survived by adopting Native American agriculture. In southern colonies, the reality of climate made this distinction harder to maintain. Virginia, the Carolinas, and eventually Georgia were simply too hot and humid for wheat to thrive reliably. Wheat crops in these regions were vulnerable to rust, a fungal disease that flourished in humid conditions. They were attacked by insects that didn't exist in England's cooler climate. The wheat that did manage to grow often produced grain of poor quality, with lower protein content and worse baking properties than wheat grown further north. Southern colonists who tried to maintain wheat cultivation found themselves fighting a losing battle against American ecology. Corn simply worked better, producing reliable harvests year after year in conditions where wheat failed repeatedly. This forced Southern colonists to confront their prejudices about corn earlier and more completely than their Northern counterparts. By the early 1700s, corn had become the dominant grain crop throughout the Southern colonies. Cornbread became the daily bread for most Southern families, not because they preferred it, but because it was what grew reliably. Over time, this necessity transformed into regional identity. Southern food culture developed around corn in ways that Northern food culture did not. Dishes like grits, hominy, and various forms of cornbread became distinctive Southern foods, marking a regional identity that embraced the reality of American agriculture rather than clinging to English grain preferences. The westward expansion of American settlement in the 1700s and 1800s accelerated corn's dominance. Frontier families pushing into the Appalachian Mountains, across the Ohio River Valley, and eventually onto the Great Plains couldn't afford to wait for wheat culture to develop. They needed food immediately, and corn provided it. A frontier family could clear a patch of forest, plant corn among the stumps, no plowing required, and have food within a few months. Corn could be planted in late spring and harvested in late summer or early autumn, fitting into the chaotic schedule of frontier life, where families were simultaneously building homes, hunting for meat, and trying to establish themselves in unfamiliar territory. Wheat required more preparation, more tools, and more time than frontier families had available. Mountain men and frontiersmen who pushed furthest into the wilderness relied on corn more than any other crop. These were men who lived on the edge of starvation, moving through territories where hunting and foraging supplemented small gardens planted wherever they happened to be. They carried cornmeal in leather bags because it was lightweight, high in calories, and could be prepared into food with minimal equipment. A mountain man could mix cornmeal with water and salt, form it into small cakes, and bake them on a flat rock next to a campfire. This wasn't sophisticated cooking, but it kept men alive in conditions where sophisticated cooking was impossible. Cornmeal didn't spoil quickly, didn't require refrigeration, and could sustain a man through weeks of hard travel through wilderness. The transformation of corn from despised Native American crop to essential American staple happened gradually over the colonial period and accelerated during westward expansion. By 1800, corn had become the most widely cultivated grain in the United States, surpassing wheat by a wide margin. Americans were growing corn everywhere from New England to the Deep South, from coastal settlements to frontier outposts. The crop had proven itself through sheer utility. It grew where other grains failed. It produced abundant yields with minimal inputs, and it could be used in dozens of different ways. Corn could be eaten fresh, dried and stored, ground into meal, fermented into whiskey, or fed to livestock. Its versatility made it indispensable. Yet even as Americans depended on corn for survival, they maintained ambivalent feelings about it. Corn was associated with poverty, with frontier roughness, with a lack of refinement. Wealthy Americans still preferred wheat bread and looked down on cornbread as food for the poor or for rural people who hadn't achieved proper civilized status. This attitude persisted well into the 1800s and in some ways continues today. Cornbread remains associated with Southern and rural American cuisine, while wheat bread is universal and largely unmarked as belonging to any particular regional or class identity. The crop that saved American colonists from extinction never entirely escaped its status as somehow less than wheat. The irony of this prejudice becomes clear when examining the actual nutritional and agricultural properties of corn versus wheat. Corn produces significantly more calories per acre than wheat under comparable growing conditions. Corn is more drought-resistant than wheat, making it more reliable in regions with variable rainfall. Corn can grow in a wider range of climates than wheat, from southern Canada to Mexico. Corn stores well when properly dried, maintaining its food value for years if kept dry and protected from pests. In almost every practical measure, corn was better suited to American conditions than wheat. The colonists' initial rejection of it was based entirely on cultural prejudice, not on any objective assessment of its value as a food crop. The Native American agricultural knowledge that went into developing corn was sophisticated beyond what European colonists initially recognized. Corn didn't exist in the wild. It had been developed over thousands of years from a wild grass called teosinte that grew in Mexico. Teosinte bears almost no resemblance to modern corn. Its seeds are tiny, hard, and arranged in small clusters rather than on large ears. The transformation from teosinte to corn required deliberate, sustained selective breeding over countless generations. Native American farmers saved seeds from plants that showed desirable characteristics, larger kernels, more kernels per ear, ears that stayed attached to the plant for easier harvesting. They crossbred different varieties to combine favorable traits. They adapted corn to different climates and growing conditions through careful selection and breeding. This was advanced agricultural science, achieved without written records or formal scientific institutions, through accumulated knowledge passed from generation to generation. By the time Europeans arrived in North America, Native Americans had developed hundreds of distinct corn varieties adapted to specific regional conditions. Northeastern tribes grew varieties that matured quickly in the short growing season. Southwestern tribes grew drought-resistant varieties that could produce crops with minimal rainfall. Some varieties were bred for sweet flavor and eaten fresh. Others were bred for easy drying and long-term storage. Some produced flour corn with soft kernels that ground easily. Others produced flint corn with hard kernels that stored well and resisted pests. This diversity represented centuries of careful agricultural development, creating a crop that could feed people across a vast geographic range with wildly different climate conditions. European colonists initially failed to recognize this sophistication. They saw Native Americans planting corn in mounds rather than rows and concluded this was primitive. They saw the lack of metal plows and assumed Native American agriculture was less advanced than European methods. They were wrong. The mound method of planting was specifically designed for American conditions. The mounds provided better drainage than flat planting, preventing roots from drowning in heavy rains. The mounds warmed faster in spring, allowing earlier planting and longer growing seasons. The mounds concentrated nutrients and made fertilization more efficient. Planting multiple crops in the same mound created ecological relationships that benefited all the plants involved. This was sophisticated permaculture, not primitive farming. The colonists who survived and thrived were the ones who eventually learned these lessons. They adopted Native American corn varieties rather than trying to import European grain. They learned to plant in mounds. They learned to mix crops following the Three Sisters method. They learned Native American techniques for preserving and preparing corn, including the critical process of nixtamalization. Nixtamalization involves treating dried corn with wood ash or lime water, which sounds strange but accomplishes something important. It breaks down the corn's cellulose structure, making its nutrients more bioavailable. Corn that hasn't been nixtamalized can cause niacin deficiency, leading to a disease called pellagra that causes skin lesions, diarrhea, and eventually death. Native Americans discovered this process thousands of years ago, preventing pellagra in populations that relied heavily on corn. European settlers who ate corn without nixtamalization sometimes developed pellagra, particularly in the southern states where corn replaced almost all other grains. This caused periodic pellagra epidemics in the 1700s and 1800s, especially among poor Southerners who ate little besides cornmeal. The disease wasn't understood until the early 1900s, when researchers finally figured out the niacin connection and realized that Native Americans had solved this problem millennia earlier. The process of accepting corn and Native American agricultural methods was part of a larger transformation in colonial identity. Early settlers tried to recreate England in America, maintaining English crops, English building styles, English social structures, and English identity. This proved impossible. America was not England. The climate was different. The soil was different. The whole ecological context was different. Settlers who insisted on maintaining purely English practices died or failed. Settlers who adapted learned from Native Americans, who adopted American crops, who developed new techniques for American conditions, survived, and eventually prospered. This adaptation created a new identity that was no longer purely English, but not fully Native American either. It was something emerging in between, something that would eventually become American. Corn sits at the center of this transformation. It was the most visible symbol of settlers abandoning European agricultural methods and adopting Native American knowledge. Every time a colonist planted corn, he was admitting that European methods were inadequate, and that Native Americans had figured out how to thrive in conditions that baffled Europeans. This admission was difficult for people who had been raised to believe in European superiority. It challenged their entire worldview. Some colonists made this adjustment quickly. Others resisted for years or generations. But eventually, reality won. Corn worked. Wheat didn't, at least not reliably. Survival required accepting this fact. The frontier families who pushed westward in the 1700s and 1800s had no time for cultural prejudice about grain. These were practical people facing harsh conditions. A family settling in Kentucky in 1780 or Ohio in 1800 or Kansas in 1860 needed food immediately. They couldn't spend years establishing wheat fields and building mills. They planted corn in their first spring and had food by autumn. Corn kept their children alive while they built homes, cleared more land, and gradually developed farms that might eventually support wheat cultivation. By the time those farms were established, the families had usually become accustomed to corn. It was cheap, productive, and familiar. Many frontier families never made the transition to wheat as their primary grain, even when they could afford to. Cornbread had become their bread, corn whiskey their alcohol, and corn-fed pork their primary meat. Corn had woven itself into frontier culture so thoroughly that it was no longer seen as a Native American crop that they had reluctantly adopted. It was American food, the grain that had fed their parents and grandparents during the hardest years of settlement. The association between corn and American identity strengthened during the American Revolution. Corn was framed as the democratic grain, the food of free Americans, rather than of wealthy European elites. Wheat bread was what the British ate. Cornbread was what American patriots ate. This was largely propaganda, since plenty of Americans ate wheat bread when they could afford it, but the symbolic association stuck. Corn became identified with American values: practicality, democracy, self-reliance. It was the crop that ordinary people could grow without aristocratic privilege or inherited wealth. It was the grain that had sustained Americans through the hardest periods of settlement and revolution. By the early 1800s, corn had transformed from a despised Native American food into a symbol of American independence and resilience. This transformation required forgetting or minimizing corn's Native American origins. Americans wanted to believe that corn was their grain, their achievement, evidence of American ingenuity and hard work. Acknowledging that corn was actually a Native American crop, developed over thousands of years by sophisticated Native American agricultural science, complicated this narrative. So the story was simplified. Americans learned to grow corn, yes, but the emphasis was placed on American settlers' hard work in planting and harvesting it, not on the Native American knowledge that made this possible. The Three Sisters planting method was sometimes taught as a folk practice without explaining its Native American origins. Corn varieties that had been bred by Native Americans over centuries were treated as natural resources that Americans had discovered, not as products of deliberate indigenous agricultural development. This erasure was part of a larger pattern of minimizing Native American contributions to American culture and society. The peak of American corn cultivation came in the 1800s as settlement spread across the Midwest. The vast prairies of Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska proved to be ideal corn-growing territory. The deep, rich soil that had developed under centuries of prairie grass growth was incredibly fertile. The moderate rainfall was sufficient for corn, but not excessive. The hot summers provided long growing seasons. Midwest farmers discovered they could grow corn on a scale that dwarfed anything possible in the eastern states. A single family with basic equipment could plant dozens of acres. The harvests were enormous yields of 40, 50, sometimes 60 bushels per acre in good years. Corn became the foundation of Midwestern agriculture, and the Midwest became the foundation of American corn production. By the late 1800s, Americans were growing more corn than any other country in the world, and most of it came from the Midwest. This corn went into everything. Much of it fed livestock: pigs, cattle, chickens. Corn-fed livestock produced meat that tasted different from grass-fed livestock, richer and fattier. This became the standard American taste preference. Corn was processed into cornmeal, corn flour, corn syrup, corn starch, and corn oil. It was fermented into whiskey and bourbon. It was eaten fresh in summer as sweet corn. It was dried and stored for winter consumption. Corn entered the American diet in so many forms that it became invisible. People didn't think about eating corn, they just ate American food, which happened to be built on corn foundation. The average American in 1900 consumed corn in some form at almost every meal, though they might not have realized it. Cornbread, corn muffins, corn porridge for breakfast. Corn whiskey or bourbon for drinking. Corn-fed pork and beef for meat. Cornmeal in breading and batters. Corn everywhere, all the time. The industrialization of corn processing in the late 1800s and early 1900s accelerated this trend. New milling technologies made cornmeal cheaper and more uniform. Railways could transport corn from Midwestern farms to cities everywhere. Refrigeration allowed fresh corn to be shipped long distances. Food processing companies began using corn as a basic ingredient in manufactured foods. Corn syrup became a cheap sweetener for all kinds of products. Cornstarch became a thickener for soups, sauces, and countless processed foods. By the mid-1900s, corn had infiltrated the American food system so thoroughly that it was nearly impossible to eat a meal that didn't include corn in some form. Yet despite this complete dependence on corn, the cultural ambivalence never entirely disappeared. Cornbread remained marked as rural, southern, or working-class food. Corn on the cob was summer picnic food, casual and informal. Cornmeal mush or polenta was poverty food, what people ate when they couldn't afford anything better. Wheat bread remained the prestige grain, the bread served at formal dinners and fancy restaurants. This distinction persisted even as American agriculture became ever more dependent on corn, even as American diets became ever more corn-based. The crop that had saved colonists from starvation, that had enabled westward expansion, that had become the foundation of American agriculture, never entirely escaped its association with poverty and primitiveness. Understanding this history reveals something important about cultural change and survival. The European colonists who arrived in America faced a choice: adapt to American conditions or die. Many chose death, sometimes literally, by refusing to abandon European agricultural methods and European crops, even as they starved. Others adapted gradually and reluctantly, learning Native American methods while still maintaining cultural prejudices against them. The colonists who thrived were the ones who adapted most completely, who learned fastest from Native Americans, who were willing to set aside European assumptions and embrace American realities. This was true for agriculture, and it was true for countless other aspects of colonial life. The story of corn is the story of survival depending on cultural humility. It's the story of people who had to learn that their traditional knowledge was inadequate for new conditions, that the people they had dismissed as primitive actually had sophisticated solutions to problems that baffled Europeans. It's the story of slow, reluctant learning, of cultural prejudices gradually giving way to practical necessity. Some colonists made this adjustment quickly and survived. Others resisted and died. The outcome was determined not by superior European technology or civilization, but by willingness to learn from Native Americans who had already solved the problems that Europeans were just encountering. This lesson had implications far beyond agriculture. The colonists who learned to grow corn were also learning larger lessons about adaptation, about cultural exchange, about the value of local knowledge. They were learning that success in America required becoming something new, something different from what they had been in Europe. They were learning to become American. Corn was part of that transformation. Every time a settler planted corn in mounds rather than rows, used Native American varieties rather than European grain, prepared corn using Native American techniques rather than European recipes, he was participating in the creation of a new culture that blended European and Native American elements. This blending happened in countless small ways across hundreds of years, creating the complex mix of influences that became American culture. The settlers who initially mocked corn as weird or inferior were displaying a failure of imagination and pragmatism that nearly destroyed early colonial settlements. Their prejudice cost lives, hundreds of lives, possibly thousands. The starving time at Jamestown, the first winter at Plymouth. Countless small settlements that failed completely and left no record beyond a few scattered artifacts. All of these disasters could have been prevented or mitigated if settlers had been willing to immediately adopt Native American agricultural methods instead of spending years insisting that European methods must somehow be made to work. The tragedy is that the solution was right in front of them. Native Americans were living successfully in territories where colonists were starving. The knowledge existed. It just required European settlers to set aside their cultural prejudices and accept help from people they viewed as inferior. Some colonists made this leap. Squanto teaching the Pilgrims. Various Native Americans helping Jamestown settlers during periods of cooperation. Individual colonists who married into Native American communities and learned agricultural methods directly. These people transferred knowledge across cultural boundaries and saved lives. But the transfer was slow and incomplete. Colonial leaders often discouraged close relationships with Native Americans. Religious authorities preached against adopting savage practices. Social pressure reinforced European identity and looked down on colonists who became too influenced by Native American culture. These cultural barriers killed people by preventing the spread of agricultural knowledge that would have kept them alive. The full acceptance of corn took generations. By the time Americans were celebrating corn as their national grain, most of the Native Americans who had developed it had been displaced from their lands or destroyed by disease and warfare. The agricultural knowledge that had created corn's incredible diversity, hundreds of varieties adapted to specific conditions, was largely lost as Native American farming communities were destroyed and their seed stocks disappeared. What remained was a simplified version focused on a few highly productive varieties that worked well for industrial agriculture. The sophistication of Native American corn breeding was forgotten, replaced by a narrative that emphasized American agricultural innovation while minimizing indigenous contributions. Today, corn is so thoroughly identified with American agriculture that its Native American origins are sometimes treated as a historical footnote rather than as the foundation of American food security. The genetic diversity that Native American farmers maintained has been reduced to a handful of commercial varieties. The Three Sisters planting method is sometimes taught as a quaint historical practice rather than as sophisticated permaculture that offered insights modern agriculture is still rediscovering. The process of nixtamalization that prevents pellagra is largely forgotten in American corn culture, though it persists in Mexican cuisine. The full story of how Native American agricultural science saved European colonists from extinction has been simplified into a Thanksgiving tale about pilgrims learning to plant corn, erasing centuries of indigenous agricultural development, and reducing complex cultural knowledge transferred to a single symbolic gesture. The settlers who mocked corn as weird were wrong in every way it was possible to be wrong. They were wrong about corn's agricultural value. They were wrong about its nutritional properties. They were wrong about the sophistication of Native American agriculture. They were wrong about the superiority of European farming methods in American conditions. They were wrong to privilege cultural familiarity over practical effectiveness. They were wrong to let cultural prejudice prevent them from learning from people who had vital knowledge for survival. Their wrongness killed people. Their stubbornness delayed the successful establishment of American colonies by years, possibly decades. Their cultural prejudices had real consequences, measured in deaths, in failed settlements, in suffering that could have been prevented. The lesson here extends far beyond 17th century agriculture. It's about the deadly consequences of cultural arrogance, about the importance of learning from people who know more than you do regardless of their cultural background, about the value of practical results over familiar methods. The European colonists eventually learned these lessons, though many died before the learning was complete. They learned that survival in new conditions requires setting aside assumptions and adapting to reality. They learned that traditional knowledge from home might be inadequate for new circumstances. They learned that people they had dismissed as primitive might possess sophisticated expertise that exceeded European knowledge in specific domains. These are lessons that remain relevant. Cultural prejudices still prevent people from recognizing valuable knowledge. Attachment to familiar methods still makes people resist better alternatives. Pride still makes people reluctant to learn from those they consider inferior. The story of European settlers slowly, reluctantly learning to accept corn is ultimately a story about the difficulty of overcoming these universal human tendencies and the cost of failing to overcome them. Corn saved the American frontier from starvation, but only after settlers finally admitted they needed saving and accepted help from people they had initially dismissed. That acceptance took years of suffering, thousands of deaths, and a gradual erosion of cultural prejudices that had made settlers prefer starvation to acknowledging Native American agricultural superiority. The weird native plant that settlers mocked became the foundation of American agriculture, the crop that fed westward expansion and supported the development of the United States. It did so not because settlers discovered its value on their own, but because Native Americans had already developed it over thousands of years into exactly what American conditions required. The settlers eventually learned this. The tragedy is how long it took them, and how many people died while they were learning.